the way this happened is I had the good fortune of meeting Jane at her first ALA conference in Orlando, Florida in June of 2004. At that conference, Jane was going to give her initial poster session to publicize what she's been doing in Nicaragua. I happened to be volunteering at the International Relations Roundtable International Visitors booth when Jane approached with a question asking for the location of the poster sessions. And when I saw this very kind, dynamic woman wearing a badge saying she was from Nicaragua with a very American accent, I was very intrigued, answered her question. Actually, my shift was ending, so I decided I'll just continue talking with this woman, learn more about what she's doing in Nicaragua, and take her to where her poster session is to be held. And from that, hearing her story of the evolution of her work in Nicaragua over a short period of time, from her hotel to leasing a building where she could then make a library collection available to this village with no bookstore, no library, no source of books for the hungry population, I thought to myself and said to Jane, I'm going to come and see you someday. Little did I know that the following summer of August '05 would find me in San Juan del Sur with a group of Simmons students from the Graduate School of Library and Information Science as volunteers to help and learn what Jane is doing in lending books in this village.
I was initially interested when Denise Davis talked to me about meeting this amazing woman named Jane Meredith and these grassroots libraries that were started down in Nicaragua. And I was one of the co-chairs of the international club that we started up at Simmons, so it sounded like a natural fit for me to plan this trip.
I think when you're in a new place, it's like very sensory. All of a sudden you hear everything, you smell everything, you see everything in a way that you maybe don't in an environment that you're used to being in. So I think at the airport I heard a lot of Spanish, as we started to get out into the terminal and stuff. And it was exciting, but it was also scary a little bit. Kind of like, wow, this is really happening. This is life in another language.
We land in Managua. It's roughly a 2-hour ride from Managua to the village of San Juan del Sur and along the Pan American Highway, and yet Jane arranged for us to kind of make it a stop and go trip to see the countryside, including volcanoes and roadside stands as well as living situations. So it was beautiful, but I was frankly shocked to firsthand witness, being my first time in a third world country, the level of poverty that is so visceral.
The town San Juan del Sur is on the Pacific coast. You have these beautiful sunsets out over the ocean. You have all sorts of tropical plants and animals that are just beautiful and so forth. At the same time, you also you have this there's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of things regarding infrastructure, things like the electricity that don't function very well, and that's something that you're constantly aware of at the same time. And you walk through the town and you'll just see these, at one point you'll see where it seems like you've got this brand new building, and especially there's been all this development. There's a lot of expatriates there from outside the country and so forth, so you'll see these brand new buildings, you'll see these really nice cars and everything. And on the other hand, you'll walk down the street and you'll be walking through 2 inches of mud.
What I recall having the impression of was seeing this small library that Jane has managed to put together so well in a short period of time on one of the main streets of San Juan del Sur, as I mentioned earlier, literally half a block from her hotel, painted blue and white, the colors of the International Library symbol with the book symbol itself painted on the facade. And myself and the students who went that first year, I remember us all just saying, oh, this is so, it sounds cliche, but it was cute. It was like a dollhouse of a library.
I think it's a librarian's dream, actually, is to have this 2-bedroom or two-room library that everything that's in there, and exactly where it is, and you have this wonderful community that walks in, these kids that they say, oh, I've read all of that, I want to read something else. And it felt like because it was so uncomplicated. It felt like we were getting back to the roots of librarianship.
Jane has organized outreach of her library services to surrounding villages of San Juan del Sur in the countryside. This way, these people receive a visit from the bookmobile, maybe once a month, depending on the schedule, but knowing that there will be a regular cycle in which they will be able to select books. The children as well as the teachers in these one-room schoolhouses that are scattered across the district of San Juan.
So the mobile project was probably the most exciting part of the trip, is to get in this truck with boxes of books and head out into, into this rough countryside where the roads are rough and and muddy, and it's just a wild adventure. And
so it starts at about 8 in the morning. So we went across the street, and the Movil itself is 2 pickup trucks, pretty much, or 1 pickup truck depending, with big blue, Tupperware crates filled with books and toys that are packed up on the back with bungee cords. We got out of the truck and set to work of unloading the bins and bringing them up into the school, and usually there'll be a patio or somewhere where they set out the books, and then they have a portable table, a plastic table that they set up, and that's the circulation desk pretty much. And they use color-coded cards. That's their system. That's their circulation system. And just kind of takes 2 minutes. Set it up, set the table up, put the bins of the books out, and usually they're organized by age appropriate, in bands of ages. And then the teacher kind of quietly starts sending the kids out in groups. And a lot of times, because I think these are country schools, there were a wide range of ages that were attending there. So the kids would just start coming out, and they are allowed to they bring back the books that they have, and then they're allowed to borrow new books. And yeah, it just kind of works.
Just imagine getting to one of these schools, and it's elementary schools that are so far away from the town that they couldn't possibly get in and borrow books. And so we come there, and all these kids start flooding out of these little their schools, and it's just the most remarkable thing. You just feel like Santa Claus.
And so one of the bins is filled with baseball bats, balls, jump ropes, and so that was one of the best parts too, was to kind of unload that stuff. We got a baseball game going at one of the other schools, which was fantastic. I was blown away by the kids playing baseball. I mean, of course, baseball is really big in Central America. There was one boy who was a real hot shot hitter, and so he was right in there, and a couple of his friends got in too. And there were a couple of girls, I want to say they were maybe 10 or 11, kind of hanging back, just sort of watching, like maybe they wanted to participate, but they weren't. And so the hot shot boy, they were kind of loitering behind him, and I was kind of like, yeah, we got some hitters back here. They just stepped up there, and the pitcher, the kid that was pitching, just pitched it to him, and the first girl just cracked it. She just cracked it. It was like the greatest hit, and she just started running, and you could tell she was just like thrilled with herself. And then the second girl got involved, and they ended up being kind of the stars of the game, and it was one of the greatest things I've ever seen. They're kind of shy in their manner, but once they got going, they were just totally into it, and they would kind of turn to the side and hide their hand, and then they would look at me and be like, we're in it too. One of the things that has happened, partly I think as a result of what Jane Merendette has been doing with San Juan, is, she established this foundation in the States, the Hester J. Hodgdon Libraries for All program, which helps to provide kind of startup supplies and money to other groups wanting to start libraries. And at the same time, there's also a project really involved in Nicaragua through the state of Wisconsin, the Wisconsin-Nicaragua Partners Project, which has been going for about 40 years. And part of what they're doing involves libraries. So we actually went and got to see a couple of their libraries that were opening while we were there.
Shenandoah was it felt like the whole town was there waiting for us to come. The people there in charge of the center had invited most of the town's librarians. So there was interest, and yet you could detect a little bit of skepticism from the professional librarians, wondering if this was being done, in a professional, correct library way.
There's this assumption that books are precious and you don't want to let them out of the library because they'll be ruined, they won't come back, and so forth. So when Jane brings up her statistics that in the high 90% of the books that she loans comes back, that's kind of a surprise to a lot of these librarians. And I think that that's part of what Jane is doing, is sort of preaching the gospel of lending libraries and saying this can work well, and this can be a huge benefit to communities. And sure, you lose a book here and there, but ultimately it's not about that. It's about helping people, giving them access to information, giving them the opportunity to read.
I was helping film some of the opening ceremony, and while I was doing that, this boy came over to me who was about 11 and kind of was like standing around me wanting to know what I was doing, and his name was Humberto. He wanted to introduce me to his brothers. He said he lived across the street from the library, and so he took me outside and he rounded up his brothers and he brought them over and kind of dusted them all off and presented them to me to be introduced, and they all very graciously shook my hand, and even the 4-year-old. In the course of the day, what I kind of started to understand was that because they don't have lending libraries in Nicaragua, the whole idea of it was a little bit funny to them, and the idea that they could just go in and take out books and use them and return them.
Tippy Tapa was on a much smaller scale. As I mentioned before, it's literally within a woman's home, and this woman's home is just a couple of rooms, and she's pretty much giving over half of her home over to this learning resource center, and has designated one small room as the book room, if you will.
It had started out with a donation of books, I think part of which had come from Jane's Library in a Box startup kit. And it was essentially one shelf of books in the back room. But we looked at, when we were there, they showed us some of the borrowing cards of the children who'd been taking books out, and you could see that these children had read their way through the collection. I mean, there were children that had gone on to multiple cards full of books in the 5 months since the library had opened. And so you could see that there was this real demand for these reading materials there, and the kids were taking advantage of that.
I worked in a public library in a really rough area in Denver, and always thought that I was really roughing it in what kind of access to materials we had and what we could actually give people. And we worked with a lot of immigrants, and I just really loved that place. But that was like the Taj Mahal compared to what Nicaragua had. I think that the concept is the same. And I think that that's what we found so wonderful and romantic about Nicaraguan libraries, was that the concept is the same. And the desire to give true and good information to people and let them choose that.
One of Jane's employees in the hotel, without being prompted by Jane, he himself, is reading to his child at night. The child has their own little book collection underneath the family TV. I mean, these are things that would not have occurred in this village had it not been, at least in this instance, for the catalyst of Jane proliferating all these books.
If you were to ask the average person in the United States walking down the street about Nicaragua, I think you'd get some very interesting responses. I think people remember, that there were these civil wars, 2 wars in a row in the 70s and in the 80s, and that for years that was the only thing people heard about Nicaragua. And so there's kind of this image of this sort of lawless country where everyone has an M16, and there's just sort of anarchy. And that is not the reality in Nicaragua now. But the myth persists, and when I would tell my friends that I was going to Nicaragua, they looked at me very strangely. And I had a friend in New Jersey who was convinced that I would need to arm myself with a machete or something like that before I went down. And so I think that, this is something that it's difficult, because when things aren't happening, when there's not a war, it tends to drop off the front page, and that's just the way the news cycle works. But people it's important to remember that for all these places where you may not hear about them so much anymore, there are still people living their lives there every day, and there are still needs that need to be met. And so I think that's a real challenge, is trying to make sure that these things, Nicaragua isn't in the news only when it has a war, or really any country, only when it has a war or when something bad happens, but that there are people aware of the good things that are happening and the opportunities that are there and what needs to be done to really, improve people's lives.
En el viento y en las flores, en la tierra y en el agua, se oye todita sacodo para que nunca las calle. Son las voces infantiles